I'm recording, and I am muting everybody. And now I am going to unmute the members of the panel. See if I do this correctly. This is the sloppy part. There we go. And Tanya. Nope, I just muted her again. And that's it. So, come on, mute. There we go. No. All right. Well, we'll fix that in a minute. Okay. Again, if you're interested in seeing the person who's speaking, please go to speaker mode. Hey, Chris. Let me just make Chris a co-host. And so I want to, oh, Fran's here too. Okay. Let's make her. Okay. We're back. Okay, now we're going to do this right. My name is Jordan Becker. I am the secretary of the grade class of 1982. Thank you for joining us today for this, what I hope to be a very interesting panel discussion. Tonight's discussion, which is going to be on confronting racism, which is a fairly important issue at all times and right on top of the headlines right now. It will be led by two of my classmates from the class of 82, Tanya Chisholm-Miles and Mike Salmonson. For those of you who got the email from me or through your classes or from somebody else, I won't give you their entire biography. I will say that Tanya has been a dedicated volunteer for Princeton. She has been a member of the Princeton Alumni Corps Board for Civic Engagement and was the vice chair, the worldwide vice chair of the Princeton Schools Committee. She also has a daughter who's a class of 14 and two sons who don't have numbers. And from what I understand, puts together a mean barbecue for the capital area ABPA. Joining Tanya tonight is Mike Salmonson, a friend of mine from the marching band. Mike has been a member of the Princeton Prize in Race Relations Philadelphia Committee since its inception, is currently serving his second term on the national board, and also has written a musical about Abraham Lincoln, whose legacy is not particularly muddled. I'm going to turn it over to Tanya and Mike.
Thank you, Jordan. I'm Tanya, class of 82, as Jordan said, and I'm just so pleased to be here with all of you classmates and non-classmates and friends. I want to thank our co-hosts for having this panel for us. That would be Jordan and Fran, and then Chris and Heather. Thanks for the opportunity to gather. Special thanks to my co-lead, 82, Mike Salmonson. And I worked together to develop this event. Mike is a wonderful guy. I've gotten to know him and meet him, and his passion for such topic. Speaking of topics, our topic is confronting racism. And as Jordan shared early on the screen, and as we shared via the announcement, our President Eisgruber, in his statement entitled "On the Killing of George Floyd and the Importance of Confronting Racism," calls for a responsibility as we witness yet again how this nation's long legacy of racism continues to damage and destroy the lives of Black people. So from the statement, we gathered three tenets for our focus. The first is committing to stand up against racism. The second is committing to diversity, inclusivity, and human rights. And the third is committing to form a better society. We've asked our panelists to share their personal view on this topic and the tenets in the light of 4 levels of racism. The first level, internalized racism. The second, interpersonal racism. The third, institutional racism. And then the fourth, structural racism. So we're really excited for how our panelists will share from their personal view. We have an opportunity from 82 attorney David Stephen Hope. And David is the Assistant Miami-Dade County Attorney. You've read through their bios. He is very, very steeped in law. And I know David to be very analytical, very fair-minded, and a just person. 82, the Honorable Judge Jenny Rivera. the Associate Judge, New York State Court of Appeals. I've known Jenny from, oh boy, probably the summer of 1978. I know her passion when she hits a topic, and she has a passion for it, so I know the zeal that she's going to bring. And 82er Pastor Burns Stanfield. He is the senior pastor of the Fourth Presbyterian Church in South Boston. Now, Burns, it was Mike who said you're a social warrior.
Okay.
And so, so that just stuck with me. And so that's the way it got shared.
All right.
It is hard to say this, but with regret, I have to announce that unable to join us tonight is Pastor Kenyatta Yamata Taylor. And she's Princeton's associate pastor, assistant professor. Burns, I got you on my mind. For the Department of African American Studies and author from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. Late this afternoon, Pastor Taylor informed me that one, she sincerely apologizes for not being able to join us this evening. Her wife has become seriously ill. She became very, very ill on yesterday, stomach flu that persisted through the evening and has continued throughout this day. And so she must rightfully devote her time and attention to her wife and to their 4-year-old son, whose bedtime is about right now. However, we all know that Professor Taylor is no stranger to being a powerful influencer in confronting racism. Her body of work speaks for itself. We are certain our panelists will share comments that inspire and propel action, whether it's individually or collectively. As Mike prepares to moderate the panel, we'll hear from our panelists first. Then Mike will do a Q&A among the panelists, and then our class officers will call on you, our virtual audience, for another round of Q&A. Mike?
Sure. So because Professor Taylor's not here, we were going to sort of go in a particular order, but I think, and I believe, David, you would otherwise have gone second. Are you there?
I'm here.
I don't, for some reason, I don't see you, but David, if you want to just give a little introduction of your views on, what we did was we split out each of the 3 principles to each of the panelists and asked them to focus on those to start with. So David, if I could start with you, and just if you could just give a little bit of your background, how you came to the position you did, even how you got to Princeton, etc.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. And let me shout out to my former teammate and running buddy, Clint Winters. And I also have to disclose the potential bias, let everybody know that RMI's class of 14 is my goddaughter, and Tanya has been my running buddy with Dale since we first met on campus, first day of orientation, and then we both went to Wharton together.
Hey, David?
Yes.
We're getting some feedback on you. I don't know if you can change your, there's a lot of fuzziness in your.
It's very muffled. Can you get closer to your microphone or check
Sure,
your...
and let me turn down the volume too. Is that better?
I think so. Go ahead and.
Is that better?
Yes, a little bit.
I see nodding, but I don't hear anything.
No, still,
What?
still.
No?
Make sure you're,
Make sure it's not covered.
Maybe so?
no, we didn't have this problem yesterday. See if we
He
can,
was on his iPad yesterday, I think.
oh, right.
Better?
Can you lean in, just keep talking. Let's see.
Okay, well, let me talk, and if I see people like make a sign, because I'm actually not even hearing anything anymore.
Here, it's still
Tommy, can you
fairly
do me a favor?
muffled.
Can you just say something?
Can you hear us okay?
Can you hear us? Can you hear me? David?
Keep going. Say something again.
Oh, that sounds
good.
better.
That's good.
What'd you just
Yeah.
do? Yeah,
Okay, now everything's better?
Yes.
a little bit.
Okay, let me just speak up now and stay focused. Well, since Professor Taylor's not here, but it kind of fits into what I wanted to do. I wanted to take a step back instead of first just jumping into the tenet, but to what Mike said, let me give you a little background on myself, on me. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, first generation. My parents, my family is all from the West Indies. So they immigrated here to the land of opportunity, fell right into the coming to the United States as a land of opportunity, and this country being formed as a land of immigrants. Went to public high school, graduated from Peter Stuyvesant High School, got into all the schools that I applied to, went to Princeton in engineering, then worked 2 years. I was an electrical engineer and computer science major, then went to Wharton, got my MBA, went off with my own consulting, worked on Wall Street, then went back to law school, which got me down to Miami, and my job that I still have to this day as assistant Miami-Dade County attorney. In that position, I do legislation, I do federal and state court litigation, civil litigation, I do transactional work, I do administrative work, I do a litany of things. As I've been there longer, I'm doing a lot more legislation. So I've worked on a lot of our programmatic things to try and get small businesses more involved. I've worked on the county mayor's various rollout plans dealing with COVID-19, and I worked on pretty much anything my boss wants. And so that's the short and long of me. To get into what we're talking about tonight, I think in order for us to really talk about committing to the various tenets that exist and also having a real, honest discussion on race relations and the various levels of racism, we need to look back at some of the points in our history that have led us to where we are. So I'm going to cherry pick some things just from a historical perspective and context, just to show you how over 401 years, since 1619, since the first Africans were brought to North America, documented in shackles and enslaved, we've gotten to where we are. I'm not even going to get into the whole constitutional debate about Article 1, Section 2 of our Constitution, which is our founding document, which clarifies that for taxation and representation purposes, other people, of which slaves were at that time, count as 3/5 of a person. But we've had 1793 and 1850 were the two fugitive slave acts, which allowed for captured escaped slaves to be returned to their masters, right? Then let's get to around 1865. We know about the Civil War. We know that before the war ended, President Lincoln pushed through the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And then shortly after that, we had the 14th Amendment, which dealt with civil rights and equal protection, and the 15th Amendment, which was supposed to protect suffrage, the ability for people to vote. But what came from that shortly after was the enactment of Black codes and Jim Crow laws, which were passed by various states throughout the Union. And that was to enforce racial segregation and curtail the power of Black folks. 1896, we have a huge decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, U.S. Supreme Court, which says that ultimately the holding racial segregation is constitutional under the doctrine of separate but equal. Okay? And that continues on. In 1915, during the tenure of President Woodrow Wilson, who everyone knows is President of the United States, after he was President and Governor of the state of New Jersey, right, you had one of what is considered one of the cinematic epics to ever be developed, the film called Birth of a Nation, also known as The Klansman. This movie was shown at movie night at the White House under President Wilson's administration. And one of the things about that movie, which was a huge problem to this day, was it perpetrated the stereotype of the unintelligent and sexually aggressive Black man while lauding and heaping up the Ku Klux Klan as being heroic. And so I'm not here to hate on President Wilson at all, but as part of this, we need to talk about his stance and his position. So in 1911, when he was setting up to run for and to be elected for president, he wrote a letter to an AME bishop, Alexander Walters, and in it, and Bishop Walters was huge in the African American community. And in that letter, he made a promise. And one of the things he said, and I want to just read it verbatim. He said, "My sympathy with them is of long standing, and I want to assure them through you that should I become president of the United States, they may count upon me for absolute fair dealing and for everything by which I could assist in advancing the interests of their race in the United States." And I pull out that quote for a reason, because while we're here, part of the problem of what has transpired is stepping forward and stepping back, making commitments and then letting those commitments be whittled away. And so one of the knocks on President Wilson was during his administration, he allowed the segregation of the federal service departments in Washington, D.C.
Okay, David,
Yes.
I got to stop. I can actually understand you, but we're getting comment
Lots
after
of comments.
comment after comment that people want to hear what you're saying, and they can tell that it's important because they hear parts of it,
Okay.
but it's really muffled. Can you switch over to your iPod?
Yeah, let me do that.
And then maybe, Mike, maybe we can go to somebody else and then bring
Right. Is that okay, David?
Oh, sure.
David back.
Yeah, it's just for some reason
It's coming in and
it's
out.
coming in and out. So, and I know we had a much better time yesterday
Yeah,
with
when
the
I was
iPod.
on my iPad yesterday. Give me 1 second. And you know what? Don't even switch over because I might be able to pull this up really quick.
I just want to remind everybody, this is free, so.
You get what you pay for. Yep. Yep.
Jordan, can you give me the meeting ID really quickly?
You probably have to pull up the
Yeah.
email and get the link there. So,
Or do you have a headset, people are asking? I don't.
I'd have to
Yeah.
find it. I have so many. But see, that's not helping you in terms, you're talking about the microphone, right?
Right, well, no, I mean, not just headphones, but like a headset with a microphone.
Yeah, I'd have to
People
find it.
have,
Give me
I
a
don't.
Give me a second. Let me just get my the meeting ID back. Got it.
while David's working, if you didn't see it, Professor Taylor actually had an op-ed piece in today's New York Times that I would commend to everybody. I think Burns pointed it out to me, as well as there was an article in the New Yorker of hers dated June 8th, a quite lengthy article, as New Yorker articles are. Both of them, I think, are definitely worth reading, and I'm going to try and, while David's setting up, when we come back, I'm going to talk about some of the things that she pointed out in the article, since I had planned to ask her about it, and maybe we can discuss it amongst ourselves. So hopefully we're getting David back here. Oh, not yet. David, you're now on mute. So if you're trying to talk to us. See if we can get him back.
You have to unmute me on my iPad.
You are now unmuted.
Perfect. Nope.
No? What's,
It's saying the host is not allowing participants to
Got it.
unmute themselves.
okay, I'm unmuting you on your I'm trying.
Got it.
Come on. Oh, there you go. You're unmuted now.
Cool. Okay, sorry about that, folks.
No, much better.
Okay.
This is what happens when you go to the higher end and then you have a bigger problem. Okay,
Ah.
let me turn down the volume here. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, that's great, Dave.
Okay, let's see. Where should I pick up? Because I don't know what everybody heard. Anyway, so where I was actually was I was talking about President Wilson and his commitment to the African American community in terms of what he would do in support of the community if he were elected, but ultimately what he did or didn't do when he was elected was, and what I was saying before we got out was, you know, under his administration, and true, many many states were already segregated at that time. The greater DC area in terms of non-federal things were, yes, were segregated, but for the first time, under his administration, he allowed for federal services, which had been one of those safe areas for African Americans to go and work and not be discriminated against. Those areas and those departments were also segregated. Another thing was mob violence and lynching. And so he never spoke out against lynching and mob violence until 1918, 3 years before the end of his administration, but more so, as he was asked repeatedly, he never supported anti-lynching legislation. So let me stop there and come back to the whole point and tenet of diversity, inclusivity, and human rights. And in my background on my laptop screen, what you see is the car that was just run by Bubba Wallace, who is currently the only African-American driver in NASCAR, North American Stock Car Automobile Racing. This was the car that he ran in Martinsville, Virginia on Wednesday night. And you can see the symbolism from that car. You can see the statement that NASCAR, which is associated with the South, with that sort of pride, the stance that NASCAR has taken with supporting him, now taking the stance to remove Confederate flags to make sure that anyone that comes to the races feels comfortable. So when we talk about a commitment to diversity, inclusivity, and human rights, it's about what are you going to do, what power do you have, and what stake are you going to make? So I look at where I am and what I'm exposed to. I work for local government. I work for Miami-Dade County, largest county of 67 counties in the state of Florida. And I look at the things that the county has done and tries to do in order to have more diversity, have more inclusivity, and have more human rights. And so when I look at those things and I think about a commitment and I look at our country historically in terms of either what's been set up to either build a foundation or fortify that foundation or allow that foundation to grow in terms of either internalized racism or interpersonal racism or institutional or structural racism, which I look at as two sides of the same coin because they really work with one another. You have to look at what are the steps you're taking and are you really taking those steps and supporting those steps? So first and foremost, it's all about elected officials, one thing, because when we're talking about the power of the vote and we talk about the people that we have in office, then if we're really committed to diversity and inclusion and human rights, then we have to put people in office that are committed to those values. And then once you have those people that are in office that are committed to those values, then how do you see that commitment? Well, you see that commitment through the various types of legislation that they enact. What do? Do they, for example, when it comes to public dollars and the spending of public dollars? Do they make sure that contracts are let out in smaller amounts such that the non-powerful, the smaller businesses, those minority type businesses will have the ability to apply for those contracts? Or do they put in those contracts subcontractor goals, which gets this same target audience an ability to build the wherewithal and get the job experience and get those dollars to grow their businesses? Do they make sure that these types of legislative means, or when you come from a procurement standpoint, you award more points when you're scoring to a firm that puts forth a diversified team or a business plan that encompasses that it's going to use other entities and other people to get them more involved? And then the last part of that is, do you then enforce those policies? Because enforcement is key. One of the largest decisions that we all look back to in terms of starting the process to tear down segregation was Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. And so in Brown, the Supreme Court, which was dealing with the law of the land that was still there, which was Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, it said, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, as segregated schools are inherently unequal. Now, as part of this decision, they look back at a study that was done by two psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, in the 40s, that the lawyers used. And the study was a doll test. And what they did was they tested kids that were aged 3 to 7. They had 4 dolls. They were identical, except for the color, right? To see what the dolls' racial perceptions were. And they asked the children with the 4 dolls to identify 2 things: the race of the dolls and which color doll do they prefer. And a majority of the children chose the white doll and assigned positive character to it. And so when we talk about what goes on, this is a perfect example of internalized racism, where because of the situation that you're in, you as that minority, you as that Black child from 3 to 7, already feel that you are less than, you are not as qualified, you want to be like someone or something that you are not, and you don't have that self-esteem, and it just grows. I can go on, but I'll let my other speakers first talk about the other tenets, and then we can get into other things as it opens up for questions and answers.
Okay, thanks, David, and thanks for switching over. It was much better once you did, so
You're welcome.
stay on the iPad. I'm going to turn over to Judge Rivera. For those of you who are not lawyers, New York has a strangely named system. So the Supreme Court is actually the lowest court in the New York State system. Judge Rivera is actually on the highest court, which is the New York Court of Appeals. Jenny, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are the first Latina to serve on that court, correct?
Second.
Second, okay. And so Jenny is going to give us a little bit of background of her views on the institutional, broader-based race and things that she, her own perceptions, rather than as a member of the judiciary, though I'm sure it's been informed by her experiences on the judiciary, as well as being a professor of law at City University of New York Law School, which just happens to be my mother's alma mater. So,
Okay, great. Okay. So there we go. Thank you so much. And hello to all my fellow Princeton alum, especially my fellow 82ers. It's very nice to be on participating in this panel and to have this opportunity to join in this conversation. In addition to what Mike so generously described about my current and recent employment, I'll just say a little bit more about myself for those who didn't get to know me at Princeton and those who don't know me at all. So I am Puerto Rican. I grew up on the Lower East Side of New York City. I'm first generation born stateside. My mother came from Puerto Rico looking for a better life. She came in the 40s, and she, like so many other Puerto Rican women of that time, as well as Chinese American women of that time, built the garment industry in New York, which explains my great fascination and love for all gloves, because my mother worked in a glove factory and a hat factory. I'm not so much the hats, but I love the gloves. In any event, we grew up poor. I don't have a euphemism for it. It really was just poverty. And so I really didn't know anything about Princeton until my high school counselor told me that I should apply. And I would never have gone to Princeton but for the fact that Princeton offered me a wonderful financial aid package. It would not have been possible. And I say that because having read some of Professor Taylor's writings and other writings and my own experience in this area, both personal and as in my former life as an academic, I know how very well the issues that we are focusing on, not only today, but across the country in terms of equality for Black people and other people of color, that indeed those issues are completely intertwined with class and economic justice. And so I'm very interested in any part of this conversation that will discuss the various connections to those issues. Fast forward, I spent 4 very challenging years at Princeton. It was quite the cultural shock. I went on to law school, graduated from law school, obviously, and then couldn't get enough of that and went back and did a master's of law to assist in my search for a teaching position in law school, which was my great desire and what I aspired to when I was in law school. But before I did that, I was basically a civil rights lawyer and a poverty law lawyer. I worked for the Legal Aid Society and what was then called the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. So I say that because I think David did an excellent job of giving some historical context to this conversation. Some of that history, it was obvious from the chats that so many of us are well aware of, and yet it always bears, I think, repeating, because often we don't hear about that history other than in a position where you're forced to think about that history. But in any event, I will say one more thing before I talk about the tenants specifically. I just want to recognize that I have no doubt that this current conversation we're having would not have been welcomed on the campus during my 4 years at Princeton. It would have been frowned upon, laughed about. There certainly would have been some people, because that is always true, who would have been supportive and would have had an interest. But I don't think the kind of real robust conversation that I have a sense we are having nationally now could have occurred on the Princeton campus that I knew. And that is to say that I think the country has changed, but I also think that Princeton has changed. And I'm very proud of that evolution of our institution. So with that said, I'm going to turn to what I was requested to first address in my comments, the commitment to standing up against racism. And as I was thinking about this particular request and this way of thinking about what each of us not only should think is a good thing to do, but we should feel we are called upon to do, that this for me is first, of course, about the individual. What do I individually, based on who I am, the worlds that I inhabit, the influence that I may be able to have on both people and institutions, what then do I feel is my absolute duty and obligation? What calling do I have in those spaces? And I think that first requires that we explore and are self-reflective on our individual beliefs, right? Really being self-aware and willing to face the realization of how structural racism has affected each of us, no matter how hard we work against it. And I think that this commitment means you are always working against it. You're always looking at something. In the same way, let me say this, in the same way that I, as a judge and a lawyer, there is basically not a thing that I do not observe, that I do not consider through the lens of the law. It's just not possible. It's ingrained in me. I've been trained this way. I'm passionate about it. I see the world in that way. I see the world in other ways, but I always see the world in that way. So I think this commitment means you're also, and I am also committed to saying, I have to look at this through the lens of how has race tainted what I see and what I feel and what I observe? How has race informed any way that I think about things and any way that I experience life, right? So that really is an individual commitment to look at our beliefs and the way we have been influenced by this legacy of racism. And I think it also means that we recognize two things simultaneously. And I think one is the easier one for some people and one is the harder one for some people. And that is to recognize that people of color really aren't inferior. They're really not. They are just not inferior. But also that white people are not superior, right? That we are human beings with different strengths and weaknesses. But based on race, there's no one who's superior or inferior, right? And I know that that sounds, don't we know that? Haven't we come to a world where we understand that? But I think the moment tells us that that is not the case. And that is because, although we might be able to say that, again, the world that we are in has so informed us to look at people in a particular way, to box people in to particular racial classifications, as well as a bunch of other classifications that I think are interconnected, right? Gender orientation, ethnicity, immigrant status, class status, all of it. That nevertheless has really made it difficult, I think, for sometimes people to understand that they are working not on these assumptions, but on some other assumptions. Perhaps not consciously, but nevertheless, they are indeed. In addition, if we really are committed to standing up against racism, we have to be willing to look very candidly for the flaws in our most cherished institutions, in our schools, in our houses of worship, in the financial institutions that we depend on for the kind of economic security or insecurity we don't have, in our local and national government institutions. And of course now, I have to say, given the pandemic and the public health crisis, in our hospitals, in our clinics, in our medical professional services. And at the same time, which I think David was getting to sort of near the end, we have to connect to the fact that this is a global struggle for equality and justice. And I want to just turn to what I think is, for me, the common theme in my life, but also as I was thinking about these issues and that I wanted to just put on the table for the panel. And I think at the end, these various commitments that the panelists are going to talk about, and I hope we'll have a broader conversation about, although of course ostensibly they are about what do we do to address this legacy of racism that has taken us to the place we are at right now. But I think that also means that it's a commitment not just to equality regardless of race, but about justice, about what is right. And in that way, that's for me at the core of these issues. What is just and fair? And I think that I'll close with this. That takes us to what I believe is the hardest part of where we are right now. And I think that means that those who have been the beneficiaries of racism and this legacy must be willing to dismantle the structures that maintain that privilege. They have to be willing to sacrifice something. And the something can't be a day out protesting, because that's not good enough. That's important. That is significant. That is part of what has to be done. We all have to be willing to support a movement against racism and discrimination. But those who have been the beneficiaries have to be willing to think about how there can be a fair and just distribution of not just wealth, but of all the advantages, of all the comforts that come with living in the United States. And I don't think we are at that place yet, even though now, of course, there's a lot of discussion, and I know we want to get to this on the panel, about how we would distribute some of the resources that society has available. That discussion, I think, is a good one, is an important one, and we'll see where it leads us. That discussion, though, comes from the view of what do we do to address violence by law enforcement, rather than, you know what, this is not a problem just about the police. This is a problem about a country that has been founded on injustice, because it has this legacy of slavery, that much of the wealth and colonialism, I have to speak to that as a Puerto Rican, and the type of structures that we have in place that put the onus on people of color to continue to prove that they merit and entitle fair treatment and a share of that great wealth and that great advantage that the United States has wielded so strongly for more than a century. So I'll stop here and give it back to Mike, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay. So, Burns,
Yes.
I think we've asked you to focus on how we internalize the bigger injustices to ourselves in our day-to-day living, our interactions with others.
Right.
So, fire away.
Yeah, actually, what I remember from our beginning our preparatory conversation was I'm looking at number 3, committing to forming a better society, which is nice and big and fat and grandiose. I'll do my best in a second, but first let me just express my gratitude. It's great to see everybody in their Brady Bunch boxes. Thank you for Tanya and Mike organizing this, and Jordan. I just want to express gratitude. And I have to say, personally, it's nice to see 83s out there. That was the class of my wife, Lorraine Dudley, of blessed memory. And it does my heart good to see those classmates there as well. So on to the charge I heard, our commitment to forming a better society. I have to smile. I want to retreat a little bit. That seems so big and so wonderful and so idealistic. But the truth is, 40 years ago, when I was taking classes with many of you, presumably, that would be the way I might think of my vocation, to make make the world a better place, and to assume at that time that that meant something pretty meta, you know, big movements, big policies, that level of making the world better. With my own path, my own journey, and my own calling, I appreciate that Jenny used that word along the way. It took me more into the arena of relationships and communities and what I've learned to call mediating institutions, because I think this has everything to do with democracy working. And that led me to become a pastor. I am the pastor of a Presbyterian church in a neighborhood within Boston called South Boston, or Southie. If any of you are familiar with Boston history, you know it's infamous from days of busing, famous maybe in a different way from Good Will Hunting, or Whitey Bulger, who ran the liquor store a block away from my church, who lived in the projects a block away from my church, which is right next to another set of projects. I mean, it's a neighborhood with a rich and often painful history. And I've been there 29 years. It's the only church where I've pastored. And I went into this work because relationships mattered to me. Small communities mattered to me. I know the bio calls me a social warrior. We've already laughed about that a couple of times, but I really am as a pastor, Presbyterian pastor, that cares about the neighborhood and cares about people, and that was what I stepped into. But along the way, I learned about community organizing, broad-based community organizing, which is distinguished from other kinds of organizing. For those of you familiar with this world, it's organizing as taught by the Industrial Areas Foundation, the IAF, founded by Saul Alinsky some 85 years ago. Our group is called the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, GBIO for short. There are sister organizations in New York City, all over the country, and indeed across the world. And what we do is organize institutions, mainly faith-based, not exclusively. A fair number of unions and other groups are a part of us. In our case, in Boston, it's mainly synagogues, churches, mosques, and a few secular groups. And with this group, with brothers and sisters in GBIO, and I happen to be co-chair of the organization right now, we work on issues that affect the city and the state and sometimes affect the country. So we've worked on affordable housing and had some wins along the way. We've worked on education. A few years ago, we had a big win working through the state legislature on criminal justice reform. Many years ago, we have what we consider our legacy victory, which was universal health care in Massachusetts, which in turn became a model, if not the template, for the Affordable Care Act. So it's great work. And what I learned from organizing is that this personal, relational neighborhood work that I already knew was important to me, through that, you're actually practicing politics at the best sense if you make those connections. That it doesn't need to be the big meta stuff and then working in a neighborhood. They ought to be connected. So those courses I took in Woody Woo actually paid off a little bit, you know? We looked at immigration policy along the way and looked at healthcare policy, and I can kind of get my wonk on every once in a while through organizing. And that actually leads me to what I've learned from my own work and what I would like to offer as my main point for this conversation. When it comes to, as the principle says, forming a better society, when it comes to confronting racism, as we've been charged to do both by the president of Princeton and by this incredible, challenging, painful, encouraging historical moment that we're in right now, it's really important for me to realize that there's work to do on many, many levels. And I think I was hearing this from the other two panelists. It's It's about policy. It's about institutions. It's about seizing the moment for change. It's about who you vote for. It's about communities. It's about neighborhoods. It's about congregations. It's about relationships. And on my way out of my time, what I want to share is what my day looked like a few days ago. I think it was Wednesday. And it was a day when I had my regular pastoral things to do, bread and butter stuff for me. We lead a prayer service every day. That prayer service by Zoom is really important in COVID era because it's a way that a lot of folks check in, including folks who have sick parents or sick loved ones, dying parents for that matter. We had a prayer service that night. We also had a book study, reading about the prophets, always appropriate, certainly appropriate now. But in addition, I had these 3 other tasks that were important on Wednesday. Number 1 was I woke up, and with my other GBIO colleagues, we needed to mobilize people in our congregations to make a bunch of phone calls to the Speaker of the House, the Massachusetts State House. Turns out that the legislators of color caucus in Massachusetts, in the Senate and in the House of Reps, reached out to our group to say, we have legislation ready to go. It's 2 years old on police reforms for the Commonwealth. We think this is the time to move it, but the Speaker of the House is the obstacle. Can you mobilize your folks and call? So we got 350 phone calls and we shut down the Speaker's phone system. He paid attention to that. Their staff called us, he met with the caucus leaders, and the next day he announced he's ready to support the reform bills. Now we're not done. Got to make sure the governor, where we need the governor to be, and tomorrow we'll be making calls to the Senate president, who we already think is sympathetic, but we still got to do due diligence and make those calls that we do from our organized people. That was one thing. The other task from that Wednesday was to meet with some local nonprofit leaders, about a half a dozen, in South Boston. And like I said, South Boston has a fraught history when it comes to race. We're not out of that. It's gentrified a whole bunch, still an issue. And it's been kind of a third rail in a lot of political conversations in the neighborhood, but it was time. And so the next thing to do is to organize a conversation that's going to happen in 2 days, and then a week after, and probably, hopefully, several weeks after, about race in our neighborhood in South Boston. That means busing. That means the integration of public housing that happened 30 years ago. That means a lot of things, a lot of things. And we have a lot of police officers and a lot of firefighters in our neighborhood too. So that's going to happen. And the last piece, and I'm saving it for last because it might be the most precious to me, I had a socially safe distance walk with a member of my congregation, a man who's really, really important to our congregation, who grew up in the neighborhood. And he's upset by all this talk. He's upset by the demonstrations, and he's, I won't say upset, but a little agitated, I'll say. He's agitated that so many members of our church are participating in those demonstrations, including his pastor, me. And so we had a long talk just about what he grew up with in the middle of busing and how he's changed already and how he's trying to make sense of all the other changes that we are asking him to consider. It's the one-on-one personal conversation. All of this stuff matters when it comes to making society better. All of it matters when we talk about confronting racism. There's stuff at the policy level, and there's stuff way beyond police reform. So I'm not even going to get into that, but our organization is also creating a platform to push over the next 4 months. There is that policy stuff, but there's also stuff in neighborhoods, in churches, in synagogues, in mosques, and certainly stuff in very particular, precious, because I love this guy, relationships. And I lift all of those up for us, because I know we are each in different positions in our respective vocations and lives to have those conversations and push for those policies and do what needs to be done. And I'm done.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to try to be a little bit probing and a little bit provocative, as is my want, while still trying to be respectful to the tone and tenor of the conversation, as I hope everybody else will be when we open it up to everybody else. So Judge Rivera points out something, said something to me in the chat about diversity. And the question really is, we can all celebrate diversity in various ways, but does it really mean anything without organizational change? And I'll give you an example of what I do a lot of diversity training in my professional life. And I always talk to people in corporations about what I call the high school cafeteria conundrum. If you went to my suburban high school, you would think it was somewhat diverse, not terribly diverse, but it was about 1/3 African American, almost everybody else white, a small number of Latino and Asian students. But if you looked in the cafeteria and you put up an invisible wall about 1/3 down the way of the cafeteria, if you look to the left side, you would think I was in an all-white school. And if you look to the right side, you'd think I was in a purely African-American school. And I think the high school cafeteria is a paradigm for American society, right? We live in segregated neighborhoods. We tend to go to segregated schools. We tend to be in segregated houses of worships. And I'm wondering how you feel about our ability to break down the systemic racism that exists without, or do we need to break down the systemic way, in divided way that most of us live our lives? Oh boy, I scared you all.
No, Mike, let me hop in there for a second. And I think what we have to do is make the distinction between a choice and something being forced on you. So if, for example, you know, I choose in school to eat lunch or chill with my boys that happen to be my teammates, that I hang out together, and they happen to look like me, the majority, I'm good with that. But the problem is when you don't have a choice. It's when limitations have been forced on you, or decisions have been made for you, or you have been defined by someone else. And I think that's the distinction that needs to be made there. Yeah, I mean, you know, if you go into most neighborhoods look very, very similar or very homogeneous. But if you're going into a minority neighborhood, is it that way because people chose to live there and move there, like Mitchellville, where you have beautiful homes and it's nice and affluent, and that's where people decided, wow, we can make a community here? Or are you there because you have no other options? You've been, for example, we know the term redline. You're not allowed to live somewhere else, or you couldn't get financing to live somewhere else or approval to live somewhere else because those people didn't want you there, and therefore you didn't have those opportunities. So I think we need to really be honest and be careful in terms of the choices and why certain things are, and then the focus on, does this need to be broken down? Because ultimately, human nature is going to be human nature. And what we can control is, not being redundant, what we can control. And is it that harmful if my boys and I are all African American or West Indian American or whatever we are American? Or is it that I'm just hanging with them because we're the only 4 in that school, and in order for us to feel safe or to feel as if someone has our back or someone has the same understanding of what I'm going through. This is what I need to do as a survival mechanism.
Yeah, I really appreciate the emphasis on choice. I mean, it's commonly said 11 o'clock on Sunday is our country's most segregated hour. So I'm sensitive to this in terms of churches and other houses of worship. I actually feel really fortunate in that our congregation is relatively mixed and multi-ethnic, multicultural, and would love it to be more so. Although I also have to acknowledge the truth is the way we do church may not feel like to church to somebody steeped in the African, the rich African American church experience, or if somebody comes from a Latinx Pentecostal experience. There's the language issue and the Pentecostal style. So I understand they're just huge. I'm not going to expect everybody to choose to be in a Presbyterian worship style. But certainly I'm going to keep preaching radical hospitality to my folks because that's what we need to do. And we've been really fortunate with the mix and the blessings therein that we've seen.
Yeah, and David, just to be clear, I'm not saying that it's inappropriate in any way. I don't know how you break down unconscious bias of a, say, white police officer who never had experiences with African American colleagues, friends, whatever it might be. And so what do we need to do to allow for those opportunities of, or do you think we need to have opportunities for more interracial engagement among, somebody who lives in Topeka? I guess I'll give a totally different example. I once went on a summer program in the middle of Nowheresville, Illinois, and I was the first Jew that they had ever met, and they clearly had total preconceptions about what Jewish people were like. And I think, just spending a few weeks together changed that perception. So do we need to have those opportunities? And if so, how do we have them without putting the burden on people of color to say, teach me, right?
And so,
Well,
Mike,
if I can
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I just want to add something to this, which I think, although the discourse around diversity and inclusion is useful, is one that I do embrace, but I think it has too often replaced what just is discrimination. It is just replaced recognizing that certain things are just discrimination. There's no other way to look at it, that there is an individual or a group that is profiting and benefiting from the situation that doesn't want to give up that benefit. And while we need to talk about diversity and inclusion, if it is seen as a way to make integration or opportunities for engagement as palatable to those who would feel uncomfortable, but then we just have to rethink that language. Words really matter in the way we think about racism and the legacy of racism in this country. In the same way, since Burns mentioned, certain faith houses of worship which hold services in a language other than English to accommodate certain of their members. There's a long history in the United States of not being very receptive to Latinos who speak Spanish, any other language but that one. And we have to recognize that that has been a way to discriminate against Latinos, to suggest that somehow Latinos are inferior because they don't speak English or don't speak it well, without recognizing that one can be bilingual and speak both quite well. And so I think to the extent that diversity becomes, and I say it with candor, a way of thinking about what's chic for the moment, and we lose the opportunity to keep saying the reason we're talking about diversity and inclusion is because we have this legacy of racism and discrimination that we are trying to address, that again, we lose the power of the words that we started out with, which was discrimination.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, the history is so important. You know, and I think one of the things that we have to think about and maybe promote very heavily is in the schools. Our schools do not teach American history well, and to the extent that they do, I think it is a very white-centered history. You know, my kids joke about, sadly, you know, I ask them sort of like, what did you learn? And, you know, they read, my son said in English class, 4 years of high school, he read one book by a person of color. One book, as if there's no great literature by anybody else. And it was Toni Morrison. And I'm wondering whether you all have a view of our need. I'm very education focused, and you all mentioned, you know, David, you mentioned Brown versus Board of Education. I think all three of you talked about education. How important is it that we start, you know, it seems to me we're always being reactive. How do you feel that we need to be proactive by starting at the bottom with the youngest students and working their way through the education system so that when they become adults, they understand and appreciate the legacies that we're dealing with and want to change? Go ahead, David.
So, Mike, that's part of it. And so it's important in terms of lesson plans and letting, and this is more so, I look at it for the majority as opposed to the minority. This is more so to make sure that there's a greater understanding of the majority in terms of the contributions that various, whether it's Black, Brown, Latinx, Native American, you name it, have made in this country's history. But to me, it's more than just that. It's how about access to educational resources, smaller class sizes, teachers that care, equipment, lesson plans, because from that comes opportunities in order to prepare yourself to apply to better schools, to get into better schools, have better opportunities. You mentioned earlier, not to go away from what you said, but you mentioned earlier about burdens and then focusing, let's say, on rural areas and a greater understanding. And I know where you're coming from with that. But with all of that, to me, there are just so many fundamental things that continue either not to be addressed or continue to be used as Judge Rivera has said, that until we tackle those in addition, it doesn't matter if, not that it doesn't matter, but I think you know what I'm saying. If you have more than just talking about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, you know, that in the grand scheme of things isn't going to chip away at all of the walls that have been built up over the centuries in this country. And yeah, you can start with younger people, but you know what? The younger people, if you look at who's protesting, if you look at how diverse those protests are right now, they get it. they're the ones that are out there and saying, this is 2020, y'all, what the hell is going on? Okay, it's the older generations that are still saying, as some of our congressional representatives are saying right now, oh, there's no racism in America, or I lived at a time when there was really racism, as if, you know, they're deaf, dumb, and blind. So I hear you. Yes. Does that need to be done? Yeah. But look at all of the other things that also need to happen. So to help chip away at the system, healthcare. You know, we just talked about educational opportunities and exposure, job creation, criminal justice reform, and yeah, free and fair elections. You know, all of these things, living somewhere where you can turn on your water and your tap water isn't brown. You know, these are all of the things that continue to perpetuate the system that we have and keep a chasm between the haves and the have-nots, and then some of us that have been able to find our way out and make a way for ourselves, while a vast majority of us haven't had those opportunities.
Yeah, Mike, part of what you're talking about, Mike, is how we parent. I mean, obviously there's school and education too, but you know, I am at the age where it's not so much how I'm parenting my kids, but how they're teaching me. Because indeed, I mean, some of the demonstrations I've gone to have been other clergy, and that's one style. The bigger ones I've gone to are the ones that my kids have dragged me to, and indeed, I feel like a grandpa there. And you can kind of see that in Professor Taylor's article this morning as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, so for those of you who didn't see Professor Taylor's article, she does sort of suggest that our generation is too late in the game, or maybe not too late in the game, but that we have been unsuccessful. You know, she points out her kind of view is, we've been through this before. We saw this with Rodney King, and we all pushed for change in the 1990s, and where are we now? And she's very critical of older legislatures, and there's really sort of an underlying theme that this fight really belongs to the youth, and that they are the ones who are going to be able to effectuate the change. And by youth, I mean not just 15-year-olds, but you know, the young adults who are increasingly taking power in the legislatures, maybe in the judiciary, not under this administration, but in other administrations. And so I wonder whether, before we turn it over, whether just David and Jenny and Ernst, do you feel that this is a moment and that we should be optimistic? Or is it a moment that's going to pass just like so many other moments have passed?
I think it's a moment, and I'm cautiously optimistic, but we're not done. I do think it's a moment. And in terms of the youth are pushing. She's right. You're right. There's still a whole lot of power in people our age, with people our age. And so the key is whether those with power and influence are listening and open to changing, maybe faster than we thought we had to change before. But I do think it's a moment.
Yeah, I think it's a moment in history. I think it is equivalent to other very significant moments in the country's history in the past, not just in the 60s, right? Sort of the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, there are just moments when you're in that place and you know that after you're dead and gone, people are still going to be talking about this. People are going to look at this to learn from this. And so, yes, I do think it is a moment that will resonate in history and into the future. I too share Byrne's optimism that those of us who are, I guess, no longer called young by somebody, I don't know who, but God bless them. Anyway, that we can still be important voices in the conversation. And the reality is that many of us have influence and the ability to leverage institutions in the way that some younger people do not yet have that kind of opportunity. They have other power, right? Everybody has power.
That's right. That's right.
Whether they recognize it or not is another story. Whether they exercise it or not for something that's valuable to someone other than themselves, another story. But everybody's got some power. So I too am optimistic, but I am always optimistic. I think that's in part having been a civil rights lawyer when I first came into the legal profession, because the alternative is very bleak. And I just refuse to let the legacy of racism ruin my life that way.
Mm.
And I think the other thing to keep in mind is, quite frankly, the demographics are changing. In not too long, the United States will be a majority minority country. And many parts of the country already are. Of course, it's unfortunately not evenly distributed over the country, but I think the demographics are going to have to force us to reckon with our, horrible history of race relations, because it's just going to the ability for people of my skin color to rule the country as if in the ways that they have in the past just won't continue from a demographic perspective. So Jordan, I assume we have lots of hands up. I don't see them. I assume you see them. So
Right now we have
I think we'd
six
like
hands.
to.
We have six
Okay.
hands up. So I want to, is Fran, can you get on and
Okay.
there she is. Fran,
Yes. Okay. So first hand up is Lisa Gok. G-O-K. Lisa. I'm going to unmute you.
I'm trying.
Mhm.
How come I'm not able to? Okay, she's unmuted now, I believe.
Lisa.
Nope, she's still
Lisa
muted.
Gok.
All right, let me just fix. Let me try something else.
You can move to Harry too if you want. I mean, if you can't get her.
I'm having trouble getting people unmuted.
Oh, okay.
Lisa, I made it possible for you to unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself if you're still on and want to ask a question? Here we go.
No.
Still unmuted.
Still muted.
Okay.
I don't know what to do. Let's go to
Harry.
Harry next.
Harry, we're asking you to unmute yourself. Harry Eldridge.
I should be unmuted.
There you go.
Question. A lot of the political issues of this rely on voting and people who haven't voted or who've been denied their vote. What can we do more to help enable people to vote, or to understand that there are choices that need to be made and not to think that it isn't a choice at times?
Anybody want to tackle that? I mean, in my neighborhood, I encourage people to vote, and I can tell you, I mean, I'm in Massachusetts, and there's any number of efforts to try to encourage voting in other parts of the country, at least in terms of a presidential election. And actually, through the organizing network I'm a part of, we have groups like our Boston group, also in North Carolina and in Virginia and in Ohio, for example. So we will be doing outreach. I mean, we'd be going over there with people if, we will be if that's permitted or as wise to do in terms of public health. But I mean, that's one piece for us from our kind of organizations.
Well,
But also,
I don't
okay, I'm sorry.
we need to start from scratch on that issue, because there are voting rights advocates and advocates against voter suppression who have been working on this issue more than a century. I mean, right? And so I think we can look to them for guidance.
Thank you.
And support those efforts, because for me, at the end of the day, the question is, what's the movement? Where has the movement been? What is the movement saying it needs as it identifies the change that's required? And where can we be supportive of those movements, right? Sort of where can we support the advocates who are on the ground working to ensure that the vote actually has some meaning? And if we're doing that, we have to recognize that that is, again, connected to social equality, economic equality, that giving a person one vote, or giving a person, if we want to think about it that way, giving a person when there's already the right to vote, it's just recognizing that there have been obstacles and removing them and helping to remove them. But if we recognize that that one vote is not going to change anything unless we're looking at the broader picture and what are the structural impediments to bring about true change.
So Jenny, in Pennsylvania, we got very, very lucky because we had the Supreme Court that was willing to, under the state constitution, strike down horrible gerrymandering. What do you do in a state like Georgia? Somebody's saying, well, what do we do about someplace like Georgia where all of the structures in place perpetuate the, because the government is run by people who want to suppress the vote. And the judiciary, the state judiciary, is run by people who want to suppress the vote. When all those mechanisms are there, how do we, the Supreme Court has not given much teeth to the Voting Rights Act. So where do we go?
Well, yes, those are challenges. I don't think they're insurmountable. And I think there are ways to deal with barriers. But I think the question, again, is looking at it, or could be looked at as solely focusing on that right to vote. That's the thing we've got to resolve. If everybody votes, we're going to get better people in office. It's all going to go well. And I just think that that is partially true, that if there is less voter suppression, we're at least going to get better representation in the sense of there are more people involved in the political process. So if you're a democracy, if you want people involved in the political process, that resolves that issue. Whether or not that means that those who get elected are actually going to be able to address your concerns, that again, I think goes to other structural barriers to access. You're better placed in many ways, having a really good job with a good salary that lets you get out of poverty so that your voice is one that is actually heard. Then you don't have to talk so much about what are the barriers, because people who are in a different class don't usually face these kinds of barriers. That's not always true,
Right.
but more often true.
Yep. Okay, Jordan, another hand.
Yes. Okay, up next, one moment. Okay, up next is Bob Blakely. Bob?
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me, Fran?
Yes.
So I want to start out with full disclosure here. When we were on campus, I was opposed both to the divestiture from South African assets and to the gender integration of Ivy Club. So I was definitely part of the problem then rather. I was wrong about both of those things. I'm sure there are still things that I'm wrong about, but I don't want to I don't want to start out from a position of any kind of virtue. I wanted to say one thing in response to Mike Salmonson's question and then ask a question. So Mike, one of the things that I've thought for a while about this is that it's way easier to be prejudiced in the abstract than it is in the concrete. And I wonder if something like mandatory national service, I don't mean military service, I mean, you know, something that has various different aspects, but that would require everyone to get out of their hometown and meet, you know, let's say 100 of their fellow Americans from all backgrounds, would make it harder to have some of the prejudices that we have. I suspect that that's a big topic, but if people want to discuss the topic, I think it's interesting. And then the thing that I wanted to ask was, and this is to all of the speakers, you know, it's true that all of these problems are built really deeply into the structure of our society. And so the question that leaves me with right now is, if I want to, you know, act where I am, you know, how do I pick the most important thing that I can donate to or that I can add my voice to? You know, I see a bunch of things that are outrageous that, you know, I could get behind one way or another, but I'm sort of not the expert in which of these things is most important, and I would love advice.
So Bob, let me just say this to you. Ultimately, if you are at the point where you realize that there's a whole lot going on that's wrong, and I appreciate how you opened up and what you said in terms of what your perspective was while you were at Princeton, and that, you know, having those kinds of epiphanies show that we as individuals and as people can grow. And so I appreciate that, but it's going to be a personal choice for you because there's so much there. So if you go to sleep at night and you wake up and all you're thinking about is seeing visions of how George Floyd was murdered, then put your money into groups that are advocating and moving for police reform, because that's a huge problem. When you have Black and brown people who feel as if they're in, you know, basically an occupied country, and they are afraid of the group that is supposed to protect and serve. And then you look historically over our country's history and see that some of the most heinous crimes and events that have been perpetrated against people that look like me were led by the heads of the protectors, the chief of police, the police force, all of those things, protecting and also protecting those that did the crime. Anyway, going back to your question, that's a personal thing. Up to you to determine once you're in it and saying, wow, there's so much, where do I go? I mean, start with one. And if you find out that, okay, I've started with that and I'm still unfulfilled, move on to something else. But anything that you pick is going to help, because there's just so many things out there that are problematic.
Do you mind if I just jump in here for a second, Burns, before you answer the question?
Sure.
It's now almost 9:30.
Okay.
We've been going for an hour and a half. Personally, I'll stay on as long as you guys want to stay on. We have about 8 questions teed up. What I'd like to say is we're not going to take any more questions, and see if we can plow through as many of these as we can. At any point, if the panelists want to fold up your tent and go home, you know, or you know, turn it off, we understand. We asked you to commit to an hour and a half. It's an hour and a half now. So, but if you'd like to stay, I feel like we're just getting started, frankly.
Yeah.
you know, I leave that to Mike and Tanya and to the panelists. But I just feel like no more questions, and we'll just keep moving on. Sorry, Burns.
One sentence.
What were you gonna say?
I don't have a group to suggest money for. Actually, I have too many probably. But whatever you give money to, I would just say it would be great to complement that with an investment of time in sitting down with one or two or three or four people. That's what my big takeaway from organizing is, the importance of relationships across religious barriers, across neighborhood barriers, across class barriers, across so many. That has been the biggest gift of organizing to me. And you clearly are self-respect or reflective, and it'd be awesome to sit down with you, and that's going to be rich for somebody.
So I'm just going to add this to the mix. I think it's really important, Bob, and thank you for the question, because it's a sincere one and an important one that we all have to ask for ourselves. I think it's really important to, in addition to whatever sort of projects, organizations that you feel very connected to and want to support in whichever way you do that, that each individual is looking at the people who are closest to them in their life and say, you know, is there something that goes on in this relationship? Is there something that sometimes they say and I kind of look the other way, or I chuckle at it? And maybe it's time that I actually have a conversation about that. Because the reality is that, for example, when I was a civil rights lawyer, there were just people I would never be able to reach, ever. Yeah. It was just not going to happen. But each of us can reach people in some way or another who are close to us and at least engage in a conversation. I mean, I know that I have felt throughout my life sometimes very afraid or very exhausted to engage in a conversation with someone who was near and dear to me, who would say something that was just racist or homophobic. And I'd say, oh, I've got to love them notwithstanding. Oh, help me, please. But, you know, that was the kind of hard work that would take reflection from me. And I was sometimes up to the task, but in candor, not always, right? And I think that's what, in part, I was trying to say at the beginning, that we all have to find a way to commit to doing, to have even those kinds of conversations after the self-reflection, after we really think about how we look at the world based on this legacy of racism, and see if that can just inform our discussion. And perhaps, as David was suggesting, present an opportunity for growth in those relationships that advocates who spend all their time on this, sort of on other kinds of fronts, are not able to do that. And those kinds of conversations, I think, are really meaningful and can bring about real change.
Thank you, Jenny. Let's, Christina, if you'll unmute yourself. Christina Smith, class of 99.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know if you can see me, but the quick question is, I've heard a number of times in the last couple of days and even on this call, the idea of sacrifice and people having to admit what their sacrifice is. But again, it's not that I take issue with the word sacrifice, but in the sense, yes, because I think, I guess the question is, how do we get people not to see what they're doing as sacrifices, right? Sacrifice seems to be a very strong word, but when people are losing their lives, or whether literally or not being able to get like proper education and things of that nature, and I'm in Connecticut, for example, and we have, you know, one town that has tons of money for their schools and then the other one that doesn't. And this idea of sacrifice when one has a lot more that you could share and distribute. So how do we, and I don't know if people agree, but how do we move from that idea that you're sacrificing something when you're helping someone else, or you're helping your fellow, you know, human, like in our country, is my basic question.
You know, for me, there's a related issue. When people talk about white privilege, and you see some people viscerally react in a negative way to that. They say, I'm not privileged. And to me, it's like having to have that conversation to explain what that means and explain what the privilege means. And so to me, it's not a sacrifice. It's a understanding that I've been given advantages that other people don't have just because of their color of their skin or where they were born or what neighborhood they grew up in. So I don't view it as a sacrifice. I view it as a willingness to share the benefits of what society gave me.
Well, I will say this. I think recognizing that you have a racial advantage. I don't mean you as in Mike, but right, the common
I'll
you.
take it.
Have a racial advantage and someone else doesn't, right? That recognition doesn't mean, because we are human beings, that the individual who has that advantage doesn't otherwise suffer under a particular oppression in our society, right? And that's what I'm saying. We have to realize the interconnectedness of so much of this, right? Sort of the class interconnectedness, the other kinds of issues. And so, although I don't have the same aversion to using the word sacrifice, I can appreciate that it, for some people, it builds up a barrier and they just can't get past that conversation. And so words matter. Yeah. So if someone can't deal with the word sacrifice, there are other ways to communicate and engage with that person about the fact that whatever is going on in their lives, nevertheless, there are really these systems that make it difficult, if not impossible, for a significant proportion of the population to function on an equal footing. That's the realization you have to have. Once you have that realization, you can say, oh, okay, well, what would it mean to get us to equality and justice? What part of that do I play? What can I give up? And I'm sorry, at some point, people who are advantaged have to give up a part of this advantage. And by the way, that is not necessarily material goods. It could be material goods, but it really is about saying there is not white superiority. That is just not supportable. It just has no grounding other than a paradigm to oppress. And that's the big one to give up, you know. So in some way, if that conversation about how to do that, it cannot proceed if the word sacrifice is used. I can sacrifice the word sacrifice, but I think at some point you cannot get past that truth. It is for me just a core essential truth that there has to be this realization on an individual level that that is at the core of the legacy of racism. And you got to get to that place for anything else to change.
Right. So, couple things. Yeah, sacrifice. So, what Judge Rivera is just saying, actions speak louder than words. I was raised, probably like a lot of you were, that you treat people the way you want to be treated, the golden rule. And so that's the basis. And as individuals go, you know, then it's a matter of looking in your heart and saying whether or not you're willing to be honest about where you are, how you got there, how you may have been able to profit, and what are you willing to do in order to give someone conceivably the same chance at doing something that you have had. And part of that is also tearing down some of these historical stereotypes. And so we've talked about it a little, but the biggest ones that we continue to see when you turn on a television set, right? White is usually associated with good and pure and the hero, and Black is usually associated with bad and evil and the villain. And so you just see that over and over and over again. And it just becomes part of, to some people, their just way of thinking in terms of, wow, this is why I am entitled to this. This is why this happened to that person. Well, if they didn't do this, they must have done something else. So this is the end result. And so, yeah, is it going to happen overnight? No, it's not. But it's more than just going back to something that was said earlier. I think, this is something that Bob had brought up and asked about national service. Yeah, but that starts at a certain level. What about all of those folks that are already in power, our generation above, our parents' generation below us, that are in positions that help to perpetuate this system, or aspects of the system that are deleterious to Black and brown people, or other minorities, or other people that are not the majority. So it's all encompassing.
I'll just add quickly, owning our white privilege is huge. And I'll just add that this is one of those cases where my kids get this, or got this, or are getting this a lot more easily than I get it. It's one of the examples where I feel like that generation, and maybe older a little bit, but certainly younger than me, have been teaching me and leading me and pulling me and pushing me, which is as it should be.
It's interesting, Jenny, when you're talking about calling to task or pointing out to the people who are close to you. I think we've all been in that situation in one way or the other. For me, I still remember vividly the president of my eating club, who may be on this call for all I know, walking over the club one day and telling a totally inappropriate anti-Semitic joke, not knowing I was Jewish. And I pretended to chuckle because I didn't know what else to do, and I think that the kids today, to Burns's point, I think if either of my kids heard that joke today, they would scream bloody murder. I think that the younger generation really gets it. And, one of the things that I love about doing the Princeton Prize is if you ever, anybody out there is, feeling forlorn, like we're never going to make progress, we've been having these conversations forever, I encourage you to go to a Princeton Prize Award ceremony and listen to these kids, right, Fran? Because every year they continue to amaze me with their social justice work, and they just allow me to believe that things will get better. Because they do stand up in ways that we don't. Mm-hmm. So, or didn't, I should say, for whatever reason. Fran, we got more questions?
Okay, yes. David from the phone. That's, I don't have a last name, so I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, David.
I think it's David Camp.
Yeah, can y'all hear me?
Oh, okay, so.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
David, I was going to make a pitch for you. Where are you?
I'm here.
Okay.
David?
Oh, David.
Oh, it's not David.
David Camp. Okay.
Yeah. Right.
Go ahead.
So appreciate the very fine panel, and I want to raise something that is an alternative that y'all haven't talked about in terms of solutions y'all have been talking about. Is it fixing the political system? A lot of chat on that, a lot in the chat room. You're talking about, is it a resource question? Is it an interaction question? So is it is it a long-term education? Mike, I got a thing I just said in the chat. That's a very long-term social change strategy if we wait for the education system to change. It needs to happen, but come on now, right? We got to figure out how can we go more quickly. So my question is this. I worked on the Clinton administration at the behest of Joel Achenbach at the Princeton administration's conversation on race thing. I do a project that's really trying to socially engineer a shift in white culture, white people's conversational culture. Al Green is suggesting that the next president have something like a Department of Reconciliation, which I think is trying to, I don't know how you would do that. I would have my own ideas about how you socially engineer a transformation. So I guess I'm just wondering, how does the idea of a project that is trying to socially engineer things, that it doesn't preclude what y'all talked about, the politics, the people doing their own reading, but I think my orientation is, can we put our heads together to try to shift the norms, to essentially try to do that in order to accelerate the time that we can foster the other changes necessary if we change public will. So I guess I just wanted to get your comments on that and how that fits within the mix of things y'all have been talking about, which are obviously all important.
So D, let me just say this, and I hear you on that, and I'm all for projects, but projects, also in a think tank kind of way and social engineering kind of way, that's not something that is going to have an immediate impact, because you have to think through, one, you have to have the political will to get that, to start it, to bounce it around, have the conversations, and then to pick, like they're working on a vaccine, a test group to see whether or not this is something that's working. But in the interim, what needs to be happening at the same time is addressing all of those social ills that we've talked about here, and people have talked about before, and people have been talking about for eons, that we already know that exist, that can be addressed now. And so, yeah, if we do those in dovetail, love to see it. But while there's the possibility of maybe going that route, we have tangible things that conceivably can be being done now, that there needs to be a vested interest in doing that.
And I do want to tell folks who don't know David Camp that David runs a very successful program called the White Ally Toolkit. David is, and basically, David, you can correct me if I misdescribe it, but the idea is that David will come to your community and sit down and now on Zoom. Well, okay. And teach white allies how to be effective allies. And he's gotten lots of national recognition. I know most of my classmates know about his effort, but I know we have lots of people from other classes. So if you are interested, I highly commend David's work to you, and you should reach out to him if you would like to bring him to your community by Zoom or otherwise. So.
Thanks for that.
Right.
Sure.
Did the other panelists want to weigh in on my question about social engineering as a additional branch of the work?
I think there are lots of branches to the work, so amen to it. I do think right now, I don't want to lose sight of some political opportunity right now. And this is more than what we're going to do in the next month and next 4 months for sure. And all of these other levels of engagement and conversation and projects, amen to all of it. I want part of my time right now to do what I can with the political opportunity, in my case in Massachusetts, but nationally too, to seize the moment. So all part of the solution.
Thanks.
Jenny, are you going to weigh in, or are you? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay.
Jenny?
Sorry about that. No, I said I don't have anything to add right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David. I'm going to go to the next question, and John Mosler, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank the panel and the organizers. With my haircut, you may not recognize me, but Mose is my nickname. So some of you will recognize that, for better or worse. There's so much to say here, but I have a question about action, which we've talked about. And there's so many people here that are taking action in whatever way they may be. I wrote an article about COVID and my experience with that, and spoke a bit about heroism down to the level of sheltering in place as a form of heroism for many reasons, whether you're alone or just fundamentally. But I wanted to, forgive me for using the word pivot, talk about action in the context of, I thought initially this was going to be the class of 82, but we have a fascinating group of people here, people in positions of influence. What can this group do in some sort of organized fashion as a whole? Is that too much to ask in terms of Princeton University, from a leadership standpoint? Is there something that we can do on an organized basis? I mean, we see all these companies now coming out with these statements. I'm not sure quite what to say about those on an individual basis, but I wanted to pose that question. I realize it's a very big question, and I'll leave it at that.
So John, you should know that it was almost like we fed you that question, because when Tanya and I first discussed this, our intent was to talk first with the intent to lead to action, whatever that might look like. And one of the reasons why we expanded this beyond our class was there's, of course, strength in numbers. So it is our hope that this actually will lead to some concerted action of some kind. We don't know what that might be like. It's our intent that this is going to be the first of several conversations, either within the auspices of the class or more broadly, so that we can figure out an approach and how best to combine the incredible resources of our class and any other classes that want to join us in the effort. So it's the start of the conversation. I don't think we're going to get the answer to that tonight.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Just, can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll only comment. I mean, I won't speak specifically about my activities right now, but clearly time is of the essence.
Yeah.
We're in the moment. And I know we've talked about future panels, and it's, you know, talked about feeding me that question. You know, sometimes it's about small moves, sometimes it's about stages of moves, of things, of actions, as we all know. And I'll just put that out there in terms of what, you know, I don't know, you know, there always has to be a centralized group of people that formulate that action in terms of Princeton University or this group, but time is of the essence. So, you know, I'm just putting that out there in the universe right now.
Tanya, Mike, do you have a seed of an idea that we should think of?
You know, Tanya and I have sort of talked about ideas. I mean, for me, education is something I'm passionate about. And it seems to me that we all have the benefit of an extraordinary education. And so I like the idea of something that's education focused in some way. But that's just my personal bias. You know, I just like the tying, you know, here we are, the educational elite, and whether it's, you know, I always think it's a little too facile to say, oh, let's go adopt an inner city school. But if there was something meaningful and more broad and in some way education tied, that's where I'd like to go. Tanya?
Well, I know that this is just the first of a series of dialogues and discussions, and the intent was to have a stimulating conversation, which we indeed did, and we want to thank everybody for participating. And the initial idea was to head towards a civic community engagement project for our 40th reunion. And in the interim, we'll take different steps through these types of dialogues to get us there. So we don't want to be premature in trying to specifically answer your question, which is a great question. But we do want to be mindful of the various types of dialogue, panel interactions that we'll have for quite a period of time now, headed towards our 40th.
I'm going to jump in again, although I've been hesitant to do so. It's 5 to 10. I'm just, you know, trying to be solicitous of your guys' time. We have 4 questions left. Only one's from a classmate, I think. The other 3, you know. But I think, you know, again, you know, we have 131 people who are still, or 131 participants who are still on the call. So clearly there's an audience. But I don't want you all to think that you need to stay here all night. My wife was kind enough to bring me, that's why I turned off my video. My wife was kind enough to bring me some popcorn that I was eating. You guys, no, seriously.
A whole bowl of ice cream while you just said that. So yes.
Should we blow through these 4 questions?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's do it.
I'm going to go to Dinah next. She's been waiting.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. I didn't think I'd get on. I want to congratulate all of you that put this together. It's really remarkable and very, very uplifting. I have a couple of questions. I'll keep it brief. But in terms of the young people, and that this may be their fight, it's not. I teach at a state university in California, and the students are terrified. And when you think of what we had when we were undergraduates at Princeton, we didn't have internet distractions, we didn't have video game distractions. Our brains were so much more engaged than they are now with these young people. So even though we're at this age of our lives, we must stay engaged in the fight. I don't want to come right out and say that we failed this generation, these millennials, but they still need us deeply. So I'm listening to all these wonderful suggestions. They're all so brilliant, and I hope every one of them gets enacted. However, we are all here not because of the slights we had at Princeton or someone was a jerk at the Ivy Club. We're here because we witnessed an act of depravity and sadism that rocked everybody, black, white, yellow, red, that rocked us to our core. Depravity and sadism. And nobody wants to be defined, but no white person wants to be defined by that. And guess what? That's what it's like to be black a lot of the time. You get defined by the 1% of your group that gets applied to everybody else, okay? But the problem is that action. So I'm really sorry, Jenny, Honorable Jenny, that I'm gonna kind of lay this on you because you're the one that's closest to Congress and the halls of justice and everything. But are there any strategies in place or coming up the pipeline to deal with this level of corruption in our lawmakers? Because that boy did that thing, pretty much convinced that he was not going to get in any trouble. And so he's part of some sort of machinery that gave him that sense of confidence that he could murder someone in the most egregious, disgusting, prolonged, violent manner and get away with it. So when we see what's going on Capitol Hill with Mitch McConnell fighting gerrymandering and all of this corruption, all of our laws that protect us being overturned behind our backs. If you take a look what happened at the FCC and OSHA, do we have any kind of strategies coming up the pipe to really deal with this level of subversion? Because that's what it is. It is subversion of every democratic dream, hope, and tenet that we all believed in. Can you give me any kind of hope in your magic bag, Mr. Wizard? 'Cause I'm sorry, Jenny, but you're kind of it.
Oh man, then you've got a problem if I'm Let me just say, no. So look, no, I don't have any magic answers. So that's like number one, but where's the surprise in me saying that? I do think that right now there is very clearly an intense, robust conversation, and it really is a conversation amongst activists, people who are in legislative positions, people who are in law enforcement, about what really is the problem, right? The tension between is it bad apples or is it structural? How do you deal with each of those issues? Can it be both simultaneously? I think in that way, this is the former academic in me speaking, the more conversation, the more engagement, I think we just get to a better answer eventually, right? So more talking, more people involved in that. That to me is what diversity and inclusion is about. More perspectives in the conversation will get you to the kind of resolution that is one that is reflective of the real needs and concerns of the population. But I can't speak to your question about corruption and so forth, not only because I'm a judge, but because there's nothing that I can say to that in this particular moment. But I do, as I said before, I am optimistic and I do have hope because as a consequence of the work that has gone on for more than a century, I think there are now real, genuine conversations about change that will result in some response to the kinds of issues that you have raised.
Thank you.
I'm going to throw something out for people who might not know. If you are local, sometimes your police departments are actually supervised and the hiring is done by your local civil service commission. And it requires no expertise to be on that. I am the chair of my local civil service commission. I am in the midst of interviewing my local police officers to promote one of them to sergeant. And you can bet that I and my fellow commissioners are going to be asking very tough and pointed questions in their interviews about all of the events that just happened. And if you have that ability, it typically isn't a huge commitment. It's something you can do locally in your own community to make your own community better. I don't know if it's true all over the country, but this is the way it works in Philadelphia, or I'm just outside of Philadelphia. So I recommend everybody to look into that. If you really want to make a personal, specific commitment to improving your police force, you might have the ability to do it.
And your point, you're underscoring how important local and state action is right now. I mean, the leadership way up top ain't so great right now. And so that, to some extent, the answer to that is going to depend on one city, one town, one state. And I know what I'm looking at in Massachusetts. I know what we're looking at in Boston. And again, I say it is the time right now. I mean, within our group, we're looking at a particular set of police reforms because they were in the hopper, and now is when we can get them through. And then we've got like another 4 or 5 things that involve healthcare, that involve jobs, that involve better testing. We're looking at public health, working with somebody named Danielle Allen, who teaches at Harvard, and she's a political theorist, but she's gotten into public health and suppression strategy. And we're actually working on a plan that would hire returning citizens and train them to do the contact tracing, which is in everybody's interest. It's about jobs, it's about opportunity, it's about criminal justice reform, and it's about public health, for God's sake, because that's the kind of strategy that makes more sense anyway, but you were preaching, Diana, and that's getting me to preach right now. So I mean, it's going to be a multi-pronged thing, and one's going to need to prioritize within your own political jurisdiction. But it is an opportunity right now. That's what we're seeing in Massachusetts, and I'm pretty sure there's opportunities in many surprising places.
Thank you. It's encouraging.
Fran? You have a couple more, Fran? You're on mute. Franny, I don't know if you're up. You were off for a sec. There you go.
Okay, next, Bill Bandon. Bandon, class of 83.
Yes.
83. Great program, guys. I'm really thankful for, as Jordan said, your commitment to riding through this past 10 o'clock. So I'd like to talk a little bit about process. You know, a lot of the systemic change can lead to a lot of analysis paralysis about how do we eat the elephant, so to speak. Could you guys address the possibility or the efficacy of focusing on specific effects and specificity of the privileges and not so much I don't want to call them small things because they are big things, but they're specific, precise effects of privilege, and detect those specific things with precise remedies, and then accumulate those precise remedies into a trend towards systemic change. It might, you know, I think the elder generation, as opposed to what Diana was saying, is the younger generation, and what Bob was talking about in terms of the possibility that national service would be in there. But the specificity of each of these privileges, if we can get that precisely defined, might allow a broader spectrum of people to acknowledge and recognize those issues, at least in microcosm. And then there's this other microcosm that they would be able to recognize, and then that would aggregate. And the best part about it is that I think, given what Mike and everybody else was talking about, you can crowdsource that by doing that at the local and state level and the regional level, so that each one tackles it and then networks the way we're networking to accommodate that. So I mean, it's a lot to unpack. I'm sorry, but I felt that it was something that we all seem to be talking about. So this might be a strategy. You know, throwing it out to the panel.
I'd like to answer that. I'm not a panelist tonight. This is Tanya. But, you know, we've received a lot of information tonight for all of us to process individually or collectively, a lot of action-oriented steps. There's not going to be one thing that solves this that we have going on today. There's going to be a compilation of many, many different things. And If I had to say one thing that should happen now to all of us as human beings, I would say that we need to search our souls. Dinah said it best. We are here tonight only because of the witness of the murder of George Floyd. And I can tell you that from where I come from, having two godchildren whose mother is Gail, one of our classmates, having a daughter, having two sons, nieces and nephews who are Black like me, this is their reality every single waking moment. So when I say search your soul, because everybody can do that. If you have a soul that you want to search, that you want to navigate, you can do that individually. Flip it. Suppose that we're your child, laying in the middle of the street dead for hours, being shown all across the screen, all across the media for hours in Ferguson, laying in the street. That is someone's child. Suppose that were your child. Suppose that were your brother who looks like you, whose officer was a different complexion than you, with a knee on your brother's neck. What does that feel like? What does that look like? So each one of us can search our soul and we can say, what piece can I do to make this a better society? And in that, you know, as we dialogue, because this is going to be a heavy dialogue. This is not for thin-skinned people. This is going to take some serious action. This is going to take some action in the nation's service. This is going to take a call on people's lives to do something, to mobilize. Because I call it my Joshua generation. When I talk to my young folks, I know that they're going to carry the mantle. They know that I got their back. They know that I'm going to provide the supports that I can as a 60-year-old Black woman, as a 60-year-old human being. They know that's where I'm going to come from. So, Bill, not to deny your question, which is a good question, but there's so many different ways that our panelists have shared with us, have pricked our hearts, have opened our minds, have caused us to contemplate different things. My co-lead, Mike, did a great job with navigating through the panel so that each of us could receive something tonight to take away. So Burns, no, I don't want to preach, but I'm just saying where I'm coming from.
Good. You're doing it.
And, you know, there's a great opportunity here. That hurts. When I'm told that this is an opportunity, it hurts me because that could have been my brother. So it hurts me to know that my brother's life played out is considered to be a great opportunity. That hurts. The reason why I'm here tonight is because when our officers, and I very, very much appreciate the opportunity that they give to our class to gather, you know, right in the midst of all of the protests, and rightfully so, but that's not sustainable. In the midst of all the protests regarding George Floyd, you know, our officers thought, let's get together and let's do breakout rooms. And I told them, I'm here, I'm glad to see you all, but I'm hurt right now. And I'm hurt to the core. But I've been hurting for a long time, folks. I've been hurting through my days at Princeton for the stuff that people say. I've been hurting through my days at grad school. I've been hurting through my days at work. So I'm not laying all of this on you to deal with my hurt, because I'm dealing with that. But I'm laying it on you to know that search your soul and choose where it is you think you can navigate.
So Bill, let me just say one thing, dovetailing off of what Tanya just talked about. Growing up in New York, right? I remember when my boys, the fellas, when we got our driver's license. And the summer before, we all went away to school because we all graduated, all went away to school. We would go out, have a designated driver, pick everybody up. if I tell you the number of times throughout that entire summer that we got pulled over by police officers, whether it was we got pulled out of the car, whether or not the trunk got searched, whether or not they went through everything we had in the car, never got a ticket. But through all of those experiences, and it wasn't one, it wasn't two, it wasn't five, it wasn't 10, it was much more than that. And we had all had the talk before we first started driving in terms of how we interact with the police. One of my closest friends, Cosby, his father was a police officer. So we knew, yes, sir, no, sir, show them what they want, make sure, even at the time, you know, that you can see your hands. Don't be disrespectful. But through all of those times, we never, when we went out, thought that, you know what, we might not be coming home to our parents. That was not a fear. Yes, we knew that there was going to be the chances of the inconvenience and the conceivable disrespect and having to deal with that nonsense, but we weren't in fear for our lives. Now, we are. Because you don't know what the heck is going to happen. When I go for a run through Miami and I see police officers, I make sure that they can see that I'm carrying some identification. You know, you still have to think about no sudden moves, but you don't know. And so this is the fear that Tanya's talking about. I know her son Darius. I know her son Carlin. I know her daughter Ari. I know Kira and Kyle, who she's speaking about, Gail's children. And so that's part of what Black and brown people, part of the pressure and the eventual psychoses that they have to go through every single day. Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, when people were jumping up and down and acting the fool in Atlanta before the latest killing that just happened 2 nights ago, right? And she was saying like, look, you want to protest? Protest. But all of this other stuff, I can't protect you. So go home. You can't give someone a reason. But that being said, like Tanya said, spot on. There is enough there for people to identify that this system is broken, okay? When you see a situation, and this isn't even a minority, when you see a situation in Buffalo where a 75-year-old man is just standing and approaches 2 officers, says something, and then he gets a forearm shiver, gets knocked to the ground, his head is bleeding, blood is coming out of his ear, and then one of the officers bends down as if to shout at him before he's pushed away, and then what comes out initially? Oh, he lost his balance. The system is broken, and it does not take, with all due respect, a rocket scientist to see that. And until we address situations like that, because if it can happen to a 75-year-old white man, and you see what's been happening historically to Black and brown people, we have a problem which we need to address. And we have other problems. So I'll just dovetail off what Tanya said. Each of us as individuals, we were taught right and wrong. And it's not about gray right now, it's about Black and white. And what is bad? What can we do to fix that and fix other things?
Mike, I'm going to go on to the last question. I
Okay.
think Beata, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
I am hopefully unmuted now.
You are unmuted.
Okay. Wow. I appreciate this panel, and I have been planning to say since the time I raised my hand that we want everyone who is listening to actually not just understand what's happening to Black people from what's on the news, because this conversation allows us to have some input, direct input from Black people. Tanya said it so well. David said it so well, and I too am a New Yorker. So I'm going to tell you the first thing that came to mind, and what I want to tell everybody is that I'm tired. And when I say I'm tired, it's all that I can do to not cry. I'm Princeton, Harvard, Harvard. I have to prove myself every day. I'm a surgeon. I get called Miss every day. I'm one of the first 10 Black women in the world to become an orthopedic surgeon. I still get called Miss every day. So I don't want people to get it twisted that us black people who went to Princeton, that we're otherwise special and exempt from what's happening to people like George Floyd, Breonna, and everybody else. Because it could just as soon be me. I want you to understand that I go to a church that preaches being unashamedly Black. Why should I even think about being ashamed to be Black? But that's what we have to say to remind ourselves to keep going on. I want people to understand that there's COVID-19, but there's COVID-16-19. Black people have been dealing with this. You can call it a nandemic, a pandemic, or one of us since 1619. I'm tired. I'm here to help the current generation because everyone needs to know their history and the history of this country. But as John said, we need to be in a call to action fast. This cannot take another 400 years of realization and just putting little words on it and giving little inches when we need to do a triathlon for years to come. I did a silent march, and this is what I had to say, and I will end with this. And as Tanya said, one of the most, in looking at your soul, if you can't figure out how to do that, listen to good old Michael Jackson, Man in the Mirror. Pay attention to what is said. As a surgeon, this is what I believe. Ooh, can you see what color are we? Because quite frankly, without skin, we are all the same color. Okay, so let's not get that twisted, people. Everybody, this is what we are. And please, if we do nothing else as Princetonians, since we're supposed to be some of the brightest and the best, and we do have opportunities that a lot of other people do not have, can we please not tarry? Let's try and find 10 reasonable solutions. Make a statement from whatever class of Princeton it is and move on it. There are so many facets to what is happening, but we're gonna have to narrow it down because we can't approach all of them at the same time. So please understand, from my Black perspective, I am thankful. I am sorry that George Floyd had to die and it had to be done in that way. I see Black people die every day. But please understand that I am thankful that now it's a national forum that is across the races, across the country. But please, people, if we do nothing else, let's move on this. That's it.
So, dovetailing on what Vieta just said, right? She said she's tired. And so during the height of the civil rights era in the 60s, in 1964, Fannie Lou Hamer said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Yeah. And you've been hearing a lot of people say that now. So I want to take what she just said and leave you with this. One of the things that comes out of our COVID-19 world is doing things virtually. And so I've been attending virtual service. I'm Episcopal, right? My church in New York is Trinity, but my mom and my sis who are in New York, they turned me on to Washington National Cathedral. So I was watching that service today, and Reverend Dr. William Barber II gave a sermon. And
the crux of his message, and he talked for, and anybody that's Episcopal will know this, there's a long time. He talked for almost 45 minutes. And Episcopalian, they don't talk that long. Homeboy went to church, all right? But the crux of his sermon and what he kept coming back to and bringing up, Emmett Till, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Flint, voter suppression, people in a COVID-19 world, in Atlanta, in minority districts, having to wait outside in the rain because the voting machines didn't work or they didn't have enough forms, all of the stuff that we've seen before, and on and on and on, but where we decide to spend our money. He kept saying, death is no longer an option. Okay? Every example that he gave in different situations of what's going on and what has been acceptable and what shouldn't be acceptable and what the historic significance is, going back to something that I started initially, the whole 3/5 of a person, right? He said death is no longer an option. So that it's taken an 8-minute and 46-second video of someone's life being taken to finally galvanize a segment or segments of the population for whatever reason that either didn't know or didn't want to admit or weren't moved enough, that's fine. And, you know, the Lord, you know, acts in mysterious ways and chooses people, and we have no choice in that. But ultimately, back to what the Reverend said, death is no longer an option. And so at a minimum, we need to deal with stopping the killing of unarmed brown and Black men, women, and children, and go from there. And whatever else everyone in their heart sees as a problem and wants to grab onto and mobilize and commit to, that's great too. But the time to just talk or say, well, it's a bad apple. It's not a bad apple. Historically, we've seen it's just not a bad apple or bad apples. This is something that is systemic. And until we address and tear down those roots from the foundation and build back up, this will continue. And it's up to us, not the younger generation. Yes, they're out there in the streets, but we're the ones that have the financial capability. We're the ones that have the connections. We're the ones that can move mountains. We have to play our part. And so, am I hopeful? Yeah, hope's my last name. But we're at a watershed moment. And it's up to us to drive and determine where this goes. Is this going to continue as business as usual and it'll just fizzle out? Or will we actually take an action and reclaim America and the values of which we extol to other countries?
Thanks, David. Burns, I want to get some closing thoughts from you and then from the judge, and then Tanya and I will finish up.
My closing thought is amen. What he said. It's late. I have somebody waiting for me.
Go.
Amen.
Your Honor?
Yeah, it just strikes me that there are two things that's so clear. One is that there is a collective howl in this country of pain. There just is. There's no way to hear it or understand it as anything else. As a collective cry of pain, anguish, and anger. And it has been sustained for some time. Several speakers have already said this. I'm not going to repeat it. And we have in the past, as a country, been very adept at saying we hear, doing a few things, and not keeping sustained change. That is the history of the United States. So I still am hopeful that this is a moment where we're just going to make some real change, because we cannot live in a society where our communities cry out in pain and anger all the time, suffer it all the time, regardless of class, regardless of the school they went to. And it is incumbent on each of us, again, to think about what is it about this legacy of racism that allows us daily to look through the lens with that legacy and either not understand what that cry of anger and pain means and how to deal with it, or allows us to somehow discount it and ignore it. That is true. Death is not an option, but I think denial of racism, being racism deniers, is no longer an option, and not doing something that can really give us sustained change. If we can't do it now, I don't know what else is left. So that's what I would say, no.
Two just very brief thoughts from me. David, you sent chills up my spine when you said it's black and white and it's not gray. And the reason why is because when I left Princeton, I went and worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund before I went to law school. And my last day of work there, my boss, Jack Greenberg, who argued with Thurgood Marshall, Brown versus Board of Education, said to me, and I remember it vividly, he said, Mike, I don't envy your wanting to be in the civil rights space, because when I did it, it was black and white. And now it's just shades of gray, and the work is so much harder. And so I'm a little depressed because I realize he's wrong. It is black and white. It's still black and white. It's 35 years later and nothing's changed. And I guess the only thing that motivates me and keeps me hopeful is the belief that, it was my Princeton quote in my yearbook, I think, and words to live by, which is, be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity. And I think we all have that opportunity right now, in this moment, in this place, and in this time, to go out and win a victory for humanity, individually or collectively, in whatever small, medium, or large way we can, whether we're the judge at the Court of Appeals or we're just, in our local community, to start healing and understanding and maybe forgiving too. So that's what my takeaways for the night are. Anya?
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to our panelists, Judge Jenny, Attorney David, and Pastor Burns. Thank you to our class officers for enabling this, and thank you to everybody who is still on this call, 106 at 10:30, all the way up to 180 in the beginning, plus. Thank you for taking your time and being committed to what we have going on right now. I'd like to start with, I'm big in education. I enjoy education. I think it's really important. And you ever meet those parents who say, oh no, my school is fine. My kids are learning. I'm not worried about everybody else. My school is just fine. And then to them, I say that, maybe my child didn't go to school with your child whose school is fine. But I do know that one day I'm going to require services of somebody's child who didn't go to your type of school. So think about that. It's going to take all of us to do this, no matter where we come from, what we're about. There are a lot of people who are going to peter out. We understand that. That has been common. But this is going to go on, and this is going to be fixed, and justice will be served. There are a lot of folks out there who are willing to die for this because they're not willing to have their life be reflected as it has been reflected. And that's what we see with those masses of young folks being out there. We'll support them. So again, this is just the first in many of our dialogues. To my sister Vieta, I'm tired too, but guess what? I'm not weary. And it's something else when you're not weary. So to everybody on the call, we want to say thank you. Special thanks to Jordan and Fran for maintaining the hosting of this. To the class of 82, you are truly the greatest. To everyone else on the call who joins us from other classes, we thank you so much. This is the first in many, and we have several steps to take, but you know what you can do individually. So when you sleep tonight, you know what you can do individually. When you wake in the morning, you'll know what you can do individually.
Thank you, Tanya. You're done, right? You paused. I didn't want to jump.
You got it. I'm done. I am done.
I just, on behalf of the class, I just wanted to thank Tanya and Mike for stepping forward and agreeing and offering to do this, doing all the hard work to line everybody up and plan this thing out, to jump, strike when the iron was hot and jump right in and do this on relatively short notice and do such an amazing job. I want to thank the members of the panel. I want to thank all the other classes who got the word out, and the affinity groups and the other organizations that we invited to join us. And we were up to about 190 people at one point, which is amazing. I put it in the chat a few times, but I will be sending out a link to the video and the chat, hopefully tomorrow. It'll go out to all the members of the class of 82. It'll go out to the representatives from the class of 81, 83, and 84 that we've been dealing with. But if you do want it and you're not a member of one of those classes, please email me at tiger82secretary@gmail.com. It's in the chat. I'll put it in there one more time. And with that, just members of the class of 82, we're planning something for 2 weeks from tonight. It will probably be shorter. And we will get you all that information when we finally know exactly what the information will be. And I am looking forward to more conversations with Tanya and Mike about when they want to have part 2 of this, in whatever form they come up with. Thank you very much. Good night, and have a great week, everybody.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jordan. Bye-bye. Good night.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, David.